David was a seasoned journalist who had a keen interest in crime and mystery. He was always on the hunt for the next big scoop, the next sensational story, the next explosive reveal. He had earned a reputation for being fearless and relentless in his pursuit of the truth, but also reckless and ruthless in his methods. He did not care about the ethical or legal implications of his actions as long as he got the facts. He had crossed many lines, broken many rules, and made many enemies in his career. But he did not care. He was addicted to the thrill of the chase, the adrenaline of the risk, the glory of the discovery. One day, he came across a case that piqued his curiosity. It was a series of gruesome murders, all connected to churches. The victims were clergy members, religious workers, choir singers, or faithful attendees, who were found dead in their places of worship with horrific signs of torture and mutilation. The police were baffled, with no leads, no suspects, no motives. The media dubbed it the church killer case and speculated wildly that it was the work of a deranged serial killer, a fanatical cult, or a radical terrorist group. David was intrigued by the mystery, the brutality, and the symbolism of the case. He decided to investigate it on his own, without the permission or cooperation of the police. He was confident that he could crack the case and expose the truth behind the killings. David was not satisfied with the official version of the case. He sensed that there was something more to this case, something darker and deeper, that the authorities were hiding or ignoring. He decided to investigate it on his own, using his contacts and sources in the underworld of crime and journalism. He followed the trail of blood and death, from one church to another, from one city to another, across the country. He discovered that the murders were not random, but had a pattern and a purpose. They were all connected to a mysterious and secretive organization called the Order of the Holy Cross. It was a religious group led by a charismatic and fanatic pastor who claimed to have a direct communication with God. He preached a radical and violent version of Christianity, which condemned the modern world and its sins, and called for a holy war and a cleansing of the earth. He had a loyal and devoted following who obeyed his every command and were willing to kill and die for him. They were also skilled and ruthless, leaving no traces or witnesses behind. David was shocked and horrified by what he found. He realized that the pastor was the mastermind behind the murders, and that he was using them as a way of spreading his message and recruiting more followers. He also realized that the pastor was planning something bigger and more sinister, something that could endanger the lives of people. He had uncovered a conspiracy that involved powerful and influential people who were secretly supporting and funding the pastor and his group. He decided to expose him and stop him before it was too late. He managed to hack into the pastor's computer and found a treasure trove of information. He found documents, emails, photos, and videos that revealed the true nature and extent of the pastor's activities. He found evidence of his involvement in the murders of dozens of people, his connections to other extremist groups around the world, his plans for a mass attack on a major city using a biological weapon, and his ultimate goal of triggering the apocalypse. He also found videotapes of his atrocities, which showed him torturing and killing his victims in the name of God. The tapes were gruesome and disturbing, and made David sick to his stomach. He could not believe that such evil existed in the world, and that such madness could be disguised as faith. He could not believe that he had trusted this man and followed him blindly. He copied the files to his laptop and prepared to leave. He had to get out of there before the pastor or his followers returned. He had to contact the authorities and the media and expose the pastor and his cult. He had to break the biggest story of his career and become a hero. He had to save the world from this madman and his twisted vision. But he was too late. As he reached for the door, he heard a loud bang and felt a sharp pain in his chest. He looked down and saw blood spilling from his wound. He looked up and saw the pastor standing over him, holding a gun. He saw the cold, cruel smile on his face and the gleam in his eyes. He saw the end of his life and the end of his hopes. "Hello, David. I've been expecting you." David felt a surge of fear and panic. He realized that he had been spotted and pursued. He realized that he had walked into a trap. He realized that he was doomed. He tried to run, but it was useless. The pastor fired his shotgun and hit him in the chest. David fell to the floor, bleeding and gasping. He looked at the pastor and said, "Please, have mercy," David gasped, his voice barely a whisper as he struggled to cling to consciousness. The searing pain in his chest threatened to consume him, each breath a laborious struggle against the encroaching darkness. But Pastor Hargrove's eyes burned with a fanatical fervor. His lips twisted into a cruel smile that sent shivers down David's spine. "Mercy?" He scoffed, the word dripping with contempt. "You dare to speak of mercy after trespassing upon sacred ground, after daring to uncover the truth hidden within these walls?" David's vision blurred as he fought to keep his gaze locked on the pastor's face, his mind reeling with disbelief. How could a man of God be capable of such cruelty, of such wanton disregard for human life? But as Pastor Hargrove loomed over him, his shadow casting a pall over David's broken form, a sense of resignation washed over him. He knew that his quest for truth had led him down a path from which there was no return, a path that ended in the cold embrace of death. With his last ounce of strength, David uttered a final plea, a desperate prayer whispered into the void. But as the darkness closed in around him, he knew that his words would go unanswered, lost amidst the echoes of his own mortality. And in that moment, as his life ebbed away like grains of sand slipping through his fingers, David knew that some truths were better left buried in the depths of darkness, lest they consume all who dare to seek them. Amen. The old church stood on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by a high fence and a sign that warned of danger. It had been closed for decades, ever since the gruesome discoveries that had shocked the whole community. The police have found the remains of dozens of people, mostly children, in the basement of the church, along with a diary that belonged to the former priest, Father Damien. The diary revealed that he had been a serial killer, a rapist and a cannibal, who had lured his victims to the church and tortured them in the name of God. He had also claimed to have made a pact with the devil and to have gained supernatural powers from his unholy deeds. No one had dared to enter the church since then, except for two teenage friends, Jake and Leo, who were bored and curious one night. They had heard the rumors and legends about the church and wanted to see for themselves if they were true. They had brought a flashlight, a camera and a crowbar, and managed to break through the fence and the locked door of the church. They stepped inside and felt a chill run down their spines. The church was dark and silent, except for the occasional creaking of the floorboards and the wind howling outside. They saw rows of dusty pews, a stained glass window depicting the crucifixion, and a large altar with a wooden cross. They also noticed a trapdoor on the floor near the altar that led to the basement. "Let's go down there," Jake said, his voice trembling slightly. "Maybe we'll find something interesting." "Are you crazy?" Leo said, feeling a surge of fear. "That's where he did all those horrible things. We don't know what's down there. Maybe his ghost is still there, waiting for us." "Don't be such a chicken," Jake said, trying to act brave. "There's no such thing as ghosts. It's just an old building. Come on, it'll be fun." He grabbed the crowbar and pried open the trapdoor. A foul smell wafted up from the darkness below. Jake shone his flashlight into the hole and saw a narrow staircase that descended into the gloom. "Let's go," he said, and started to climb down. Leo hesitated, but followed him reluctantly. He didn't want to be left alone in the church. He hoped that Jake was right and that there was nothing to be afraid of. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves in a large, dimly lit room. There were shelves along the walls, filled with jars, bottles, books, and other objects. There was also a table in the center of the room, covered with bloodstains, knives, chains, and hooks. On the table, there was a leather-bound book with a cross on the cover. It was the diary of Father Damien. "Look at this," Jake said, picking up the book. "This is it. This is what we came for." He opened the book and flipped through the pages. They were written in a neat but twisted handwriting and contained dates, names, and descriptions of the priest's crimes. Jake read some of them aloud, his voice growing more and more horrified. "May 15th, 1978. I have taken a new child today. Her name is Anna. She is 7 years old and has blonde hair and blue eyes. She reminds me of an angel. I will make her suffer for her sins, and then I will eat her flesh and drink her blood. She will be my communion. June 3rd, 1979. I have killed another one. His name was Mark. He was 9 years old and had brown hair and green eyes. He was a smart boy, but also a sinner. He tried to escape, but I caught him and broke his legs. Then I cut off his tongue and his ears and gouged out his eyes. I wanted him to suffer, to beg for mercy, but he was strong. He didn't scream, he didn't cry. He just stared at me with his empty eye sockets, and I felt a strange admiration for him. I will miss him. July 21st, 1980. The devil has spoken to me again. He is pleased with my work and has rewarded me with new powers. I can hear his voice in my head, whispering secrets and commands. He has promised me immortality if I continue to serve him faithfully. I am his chosen one, his instrument of destruction. I will bring chaos and death to this world, in his name." Jake stopped reading, his hands shaking. Leo felt sick to his stomach and wanted to leave the basement immediately. But before he could say anything, they heard a noise behind them. They turned around and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was Father Damien. He was tall and thin, with sunken eyes and a gaunt face. He was dressed in black robes and held a silver crucifix in one hand. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his voice echoed in the room like a whisper from beyond the grave. "Who dares to enter my domain?" he said, his voice cold and menacing. "Who dares to disturb my eternal rest?" Jake and Leo were frozen with fear. They couldn't move, they couldn't speak. They felt as if they were trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Father Damien stepped forward and raised the crucifix above his head. "Leave this place, mortals," he said, his voice booming with authority. "Leave before it's too late. This is my kingdom, and you are not welcome here." With a sudden burst of courage, Jake grabbed the crowbar and swung it at Father Damien. The priest's eyes widened in surprise, and he stumbled backwards, dropping the crucifix. Jake and Leo seized the opportunity to run past him, up the stairs and out of the basement. They didn't stop running until they were outside the church, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. They looked back at the old building and saw Father Damien standing in the doorway, watching them with his glowing eyes. Then he vanished into the darkness, leaving them alone in the night. Jake and Leo never returned to the church again. They told their friends and family about their terrifying experience, but no one believed them. They were dismissed as liars and attention seekers, their story relegated to the realm of urban legend. But Jake and Leo knew the truth. They had seen the ghost of Father Damien, and they would never forget the horror of that night in the old church. My friend, Jake, has always been an eccentric guy, and his actions have often caused controversy among our friends and acquaintances. His latest stunt was his decision to sell his apartment in the city center and move to live in a remote village in America. He said he wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of urban life and reconnect with nature. Locally, he bought a small plot of land and began farming full-time from spring to late fall. He grew his own vegetables, raised his own chickens, and made his own cheese. He seemed happy and content, living a simple and rustic life. The village where he settled was a typical American town in the South. It had a main street with a few shops, a diner, a gas station, and a post office. It had a friendly and tight-knit community who welcomed Jake as one of their own. However, the village was also seasonal, and most of the residents moved away during the winter, when the weather became harsh and the roads became impassable. At the end of the season, only Jake and his garden and a cat named Bob remained. The windows of his new home overlooked a tiny cemetery that surrounded a church that seemed dilapidated. The cemetery was old and overgrown, and the church was abandoned and boarded up. Jake said he liked the quiet and the solitude, and that he didn't mind the eerie view. It was about 2 years later when Jake called me one day to say he'd be at my place in an hour, but asked me not to tell anyone he was coming. Surprised by this request, I waited for him. I wondered what had prompted him to leave his village, and why he wanted to keep his visit a secret. I wondered if he was in trouble, or if he had something to tell me. I wondered what had happened to him, and what he had seen. I wondered what secrets the village, the cemetery, and the church held. Soon I heard the sound of an engine knocking in the driveway, and I looked out the window and saw Jake's old pickup truck. It was covered in dust and dirt, and had a few dents and scratches. It looked like it had been through a lot, just like Jake. When I opened the front door, I was surprised to see that Jake had aged considerably since the last time I'd seen him. He had a few gray hairs on his head, and his face had an expression of anxiety and fear. He looked tired and worn out, and had bags under his eyes. He looked like he had seen something terrible and couldn't forget it. Once inside, I offered him something to drink to calm him down, and we sat down at the table. I asked him what was wrong, and why he was so anxious. Jake silently drank the contents of his shot glass and began his story. His voice was shaky and low, and his eyes were haunted. I don't know if you'll believe me, but it's not that important. I just need to tell someone what happened to me, he began. It started out as usual. I got up early in the morning, had breakfast, and went to do my chores. There was no one in the village anymore. Everyone had left. The village was deserted and silent, except for the wind and the birds. I decided to take a walk without fear of scaring anyone with my appearance. I put on my hat and coat and grabbed my walking stick. I headed out the door and walked towards the cemetery. I didn't notice as dusk began to fall. After bringing a pile of wood into the house, I was about to heat the stove when suddenly I heard a loud barking. I looked out the window and saw a dog that was behaving very strangely, barking in the direction of the abandoned church. It was Bob, my cat's friend, who often came to visit. He was usually calm and friendly, but now he seemed agitated and frightened. He was staring at something, but I couldn't see what. Then I heard the sound of a bell. How? After all, the bell in that church is long gone. It was removed years ago when the church was closed and condemned. It was supposed to be silent and empty, but now it was ringing loud and clear. I went outside to tie up the dog and calm him down. But as soon as I stepped out, I heard another bell ringing. It was strange. It sounded like it was coming from a different direction from another church. But there was no other church nearby, only the one in front of my house. Then I heard another and another ringing, and soon it seemed like the whole village was filled with bells. It was eerie and unsettling, and I felt a chill down my spine. I opened the wicket and saw Bob running away, barking even louder and shivering with his whole body. He scrambled into the box where he usually slept and hid under a blanket. He looked terrified, and so was I. I was alarmed and hurried into the house, locking the front door. I peered through the twilight toward the abandoned church and saw. Jake froze in place as if he was having trouble remembering further. Saw figures of men in monks' clothing carrying a wooden coffin, with candles burning around them. The figures were pale and ghostly, and they moved with a slow and solemn pace. They looked like they were part of a funeral procession, but there was no sign of life or emotion on their faces. They looked like they were dead or undead. The crowd moved slowly, and as they passed my house, I heard the long howl of my dog. He sounded like he was in pain or in fear. A woman in nun's clothes came to the window, looked in, and she said something about a blessing. Her voice was cold and hollow, and her eyes were dark and empty. She looked like she was cursed or possessed. Everyone else repeated her words in a monotone and eerie chorus. I got scared, and in a panic I started to. Jake paused and took a deep breath. He looked at me and said, "Started to pray." I prayed for God to save me, to protect me, to make them go away. I prayed for Bob, and for my cat, and for myself. I prayed for anyone who could hear me or help me. I prayed for the nightmare to end, and for the morning to come. I prayed like I never prayed before, and I hoped that someone would answer. Jake interrupted his story and took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "I'm sorry, I don't even know how to explain it. I think I've lost my mind, but I'm sure I saw something unimaginable. I can't stay here anymore. I have to get out of here, away from this place," he finished. When night fell, I suggested that Jake stay at my place for the night so he wouldn't be alone with his thoughts. We went to bed, but I felt like something was wrong. I had nightmares in my sleep, and I woke up in complete darkness, even though the room was lit by moonlight. It was then that I heard a whisper. It was a quiet but clear whisper that came from the corner of the room. I shuddered and raised myself up on my elbows, trying to see something in the darkness. But I saw nothing but the dark outline of furniture. "Who's there?" I asked, but there was no answer. The whispering stopped, and the room began to fill with a deafening silence. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream or a stress-induced hallucination. But something inside me told me that I wasn't alone in this room, something sinister and unseen. Anxiety overwhelmed me, and I decided to wake Jake up. But when I turned to wake him, I saw that his bed was empty. In its place lay only an old, tattered nun's shawl.